and welcome to the North Carolina Museum of History and the 21st Annual African American Cultural Celebration. Our presenter, Celeste Beatty, will begin in just a moment, but we want to start with a few notes. Remember to ask questions in the chat and we'll do our best to respond to them and share with our presenter. Please note that our presenters and off camera crew are masked for the safety of everyone. We thank the following sponsors of the North Carolina Museum of History Foundation for helping to make this event possible.
Welcome back, guys. I'm your host, Chef E. Marshall. I would like to introduce Celeste Beatty. She is the first African American woman to own a brewery in the United States. Her brewery, Harlem Brewing Company, began in Harlem, New York, and she has since opened a satellite extension in Rocky Mount, North Carolina, called Harlem Brew South, to support a growing southeastern consumer base. Celeste.
Hi, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for having me here this evening. I am looking forward to sharing a little bit of my journey about beer and migration. Well, let's start with the beer first. Today, we are featuring a special beer that I dedicated to my mom. It's called Queen Stout. And this is actually a picture of my mom from her 70s Afro days. So there's a picture of her with an afro, and I dedicated it to my mom and women because I just wanted to pay tribute to all the support she's shown me and so many women throughout the state of North Carolina and in our community. Um, the other story about the beer, which I'm going to pour a little bit of, as I pour it, I'm going to talk a little bit about it. So it's a chocolate coffee stout, and you can see from the color, the dark color is really mostly coffee. And then we also have chocolate. The chocolate is from Haiti, and the coffee is from Ethiopia. We have coffee from Ethiopia, Haiti, Kenya. Those are the places that the coffee are from. The story behind the coffee, aside from its color, which is pretty dark, beautiful, deep brown, hold it up, even had some reds in it, is that I really love chocolate. I eat chocolate quite a bit. And I love coffee. The two blended together, the dark flavors are really something I find to be particularly delicious. And I cook a lot with beer. We'll get to that later.
Mm.
But the coffee actually has coffee from 3 African American owned coffee shops. We have one in Rocky Mount called Yalam's Coffee. She's from Ethiopia. The other coffee shop is in Brooklyn, which is a Haitian-owned coffee company. And then the third coffee company is here in Durham. It's called Blackology. I can't pronounce the name yet of the one in Brooklyn, but I think it's called Cassava Coffee Company. And I was really excited not only to dedicate this to my mom and women, but to also support those entrepreneurs. When we think about, I'll describe the flavor to you. Very sweet, a lot of heavy coffee notes, notes of chocolate. It's just a really rich beer. My sister, my sister's daughter, Emma, has aspirations of going to culinary school, hopefully at the CIA. She'd like to go in New York. She's a senior, no, junior, about to be a senior. She surprised me and made a chocolate stout cake for my mother's birthday this past August. And it was like, wait a minute. Haven't done that yet, but she really was able to capture the flavors in the beer. So definitely would like to share this beer with you at some point. The migration, when I talk about beer and migration, it is partially the migration of beer as we think about the evolution of beer from the continent of Africa. When we think about the way beer, food, and all of that migrates, growing up here in the South, being around the Southern tradition of all the amazing foods from collard greens, cornbread, um, fried chicken, chitlins, hog maws, pig's feet. I mean, we had so much farm to table lifestyle here. I hear that a lot. But what was really interesting is that when I left the South about 30 years ago and went to New York, following in the footsteps of my three of my six uncles moved to Harlem and Queens and the Bronx in the 60s for a better life. And with them, having been embedded in the Southern tradition, they took those food traditions with them. So I wasn't surprised when I decided to move to Harlem. I visited them there many times. Soul food was everywhere. And my most favorite spot was Sylvia's restaurant. Their family, the Woods family, migrated from the South. I think the name of the place is Hemingway, South Carolina. And they took everything that influenced their lives in terms of food came from that culture of Southern cuisine that was embedded in who we are. It's part of our DNA from Africa to here. So I'm in Harlem feeling homesick, and I'm like, oh gosh, I gotta find some fish and grits. I gotta find a fish fry. I've gotta find something that reconnects me to that nourishment that I experienced growing up. And it wasn't a problem because aside from Sylvia's, we had all types of restaurants all over Harlem. Sylvia's, the Woods family, Sylvia Woods, brought that culture and the spirit of the cuisine to Harlem. Norma Darden, one of the most famous models in the world, created spoon-bread restaurants. So I would get up on mornings and go get my fish and grits at Sylvia's. I'd go over the Norma Darden spot, spoon-bread. You know, these are the places that I had a chance to really reconnect with, just to be reminded of who I am and um, where I got nourished in terms of food and culture. Now we know, as I said a moment ago, that beer is one of the most ancient beverages in the world. I mean, its history goes back thousands of years, and we know a lot about it in terms of its origins because of the history that has been well preserved in the Sudan, in the pyramids of Sudan, and the pyramids of Egypt. And when I had an opportunity to spend some time in Zimbabwe, having been involved with the beer industry for some time, I was shocked to find that the home brewing that I started doing in Harlem with my pot and my grains and all the stuff that makes up beers, you look at water, grains, yeast, all the flavorings, layers of flavor where there's coffee, chocolate, that those same unique skills that allowed people to make beer all this time being in America, that it actually started right on the continent with the women that I met in the village that have been brewing beer for longer than anyone can imagine. That was very inspiring to me. And in fact, it was one of the things that kept me in the beer industry because anyone can homebrew. But when you take a hobby that you love and try to translate it into the business, that's a whole nother thing that you have to kind of pull together. Mm-hmm. So discovering that, and then thinking back to a visit I made to Virginia, to Monticello, years ago as a student, having a chance to learn about not only the origins of beer in Africa, but the origins of beers in our history of Americans. The Hemings family, Thomas Jefferson's enslaved, the people that worked there that were enslaved. He was one of the great brewers of that time, but because of race relations and so many things, he wasn't allowed to evolve to create a brewery because of slavery. But I believe, and I'm sure many people believe, that those skills that he had with brewing wasn't just something that fell out of the sky. It wasn't just some weird thing. Those are skills that were embedded in him within his DNA because of the culture of brewing in Africa. And he was quite an amazing brewer. He got training in France, and there were so many other things that he was able to do because it was just a skill that had been passed down, despite the challenges and problems that we had in this country with slavery. We never lost those traditions, and they were very much a part of him being able to take the craft from places like Africa. This picture, the image you see here, is really, you can take that same picture and put it beside the ancient pyramids, the hieroglyphics in those pictures. It shows pictures of people that drank beer from straws or long tubes that allowed them to consume the liquid that was on top and leave the grains on the bottom, sometimes consume the grains that way as well. So when I talk about, again, beer and migration, it's really looking at, the beginnings of what beer is, the long-standing traditions of where it started and where it comes from, and how it actually came to this country. This is what I mentioned a moment ago when we talk about the evolution of beer, how the techniques and abilities of African people, those skills being brought here, such as with Peter Hemmings. There's a statement that was made that I show you here, you can read it, where Thomas Jefferson talks about how impressed he was with the skills that Peter Hemmings had. Well, I hear what you're saying, President Jefferson, but these are skills that we've had that were so embedded in our culture that when we came to this country, those skills were very much a part of who we were and are. Given the opportunity, we're able to express those abilities in the craft. This is one of the things that happens. So Peter Hemmings brewed beer for Jefferson, and there were so many other presidents during that time. They didn't brew the beer. Our ancestors that were enslaved brewed the beer, incorporating many of the techniques that I saw when I visited Africa. The Great Migration, I mentioned a moment ago that when I left North Carolina to live in Harlem and New York City, following in the footsteps of so many that came from Chicago and Texas and North Carolina and South Carolina and Georgia, trying to escape the persecution and difficulties of life in the South, bringing again all of those culinary, everything, literature, all of that was part of what became the Harlem Renaissance. And there's story after story that I'm actually going to be exploring a little bit more in my cookbook about a chapter that I have called Brewers in the Family. I could be having so many casual conversations, either in Harlem, just walking down the street, or sitting at a bar or restaurant. Where are you from? South Carolina, North Carolina, Georgia, Chicago. Everybody is pretty much either migrated there from the South, as many of us know, or migrated from various countries throughout Africa and the Caribbean, bringing those traditions, including making beer, plum wine, strawberry wine, all of that stuff was just so much a part of who we are. So naturally, when you move to another place, either voluntarily or involuntarily, you don't just forget those things. Those things come along with you. So it's very easy, as I was saying, to be sitting in a bar, at a restaurant, at an event. Once I asked them where they're from, and they asked me what I do, I said, I brew. He was like, you brew what? Beer. Oh, my grandmother used to brew beer. Oh, my uncle made moonshine. There's so many stories out there about the traditions embedded in who we are as African Americans. Brewing is very much a part of it. One story I can tell you, a woman by the name of Sharon Howard. She was one of the curators at the studio at the Schomburg Center in New York. She just very casually told me, when I asked her about beer, she's like, oh man, I used to cap the bottles for my uncle. My uncle was the brewer in the neighborhood. It's like, what? You're kidding me? Tell me about this, because I'm out here, brewing, and people look at me like, you do what? This is a white bearded guy thing. My white bearded guy friends tell me, what are you doing brewing? I'm like, well, I like beer and I like cooking with beer. Why not? I just don't see many people like you. I said, you'd be surprised how many families actually have these stories and they're just like so casual. But me, I've been like hungry trying to find these stories and just very casually running into people at events, discovering that in fact, it's so much a part of who we are. We just need to ask the question. And they're incredible stories of people, you know, fermenting their grains, their cornmeal, all these fermentable things. The whole technique that they described, you can connect it directly to a brewing process and reading about how beer was made in Africa during ancient times and today. And you're like, wait a minute, how did this happen? How is it that the description of what they remember is so consistent with the specific directions in the pyramids? How does that get carried down? It does. And how does it move around? It migrates, that information, those traditions migrate with the people wherever
Celeste,
they go. Yes.
quick question. I keep hearing you saying about like the, bearded white guys, in the struggles. What difficulties have you had, if any, of trying to be a brewer? Well, you are now, but becoming a Black woman brewer.
Some of the difficulties have just been getting people to envision and accept that people that look like me can actually brew. Because with the absence of that history that I even learned about people that look like me that have been not only doing this in ancient times, but are doing it all over the continent of Africa, it wasn't getting out or it wasn't being accepted. Once they were able to realize that, some of them still were like, I'm shaking their head. No, this is not what you guys do. So it's had some difficulties and breaking through the barriers of being thought of as a brewer, of being accepted as a even in gender woman brewer. It has had quite a bit of difficulty for me personally and other brewers that I know from our community. But as we began to get the stories out there, have an opportunity to sit with you and talk and be invited to places like that, it's really helping get this, it's breaking through the shock kind of screen that we often have to try to penetrate because we've just been so absent, like sports and other fields, that people have to get over the fact that it is possible and there's a history. So it's a continual process, but it's gotten better over the years.
So there's a community of Black brewers out there?
There is a growing community of Black brewers, yes. More
Okay.
and more and more, the craft brewing industry itself has been a breakthrough for many communities around the country. And as people are understanding what craft beer is, it's very community minded. We are able to kind of insert ourselves and do what we're most passionate about as well.
Okay. I just had that question. I was like, man, it must have been a little difficult being the first African American Black brewer out here. It was just on my mind, so I just had to ask.
I could tell you some stories, but probably not today over a beer.
Sounds about right.
So speaking of the difficulties, this is a picture of me making the transition from my home brewing, needing more capacity, and finding an opportunity to collaborate with a brewery in Saratoga Springs, which I discovered was also the place that Solomon Northup, 12 Years a Slave, was captured right down the block, literally not even a mile. For me in brewing, history is so important. And when I showed you the can, I didn't bring all the beers. We have one can, our Harlem Renaissance wit beer, which is all about celebrating the Renaissance from 1920 to 2020. 2020 was the 100th anniversary of the Harlem Renaissance. Looking at, how do we use our platforms to tell stories? Yes, having a beer is good. I won't deny that. But there's so many things that we can talk about in our communities. There's so many ways to celebrate our history and who we are. And in fact, that history is what's inspired me and many of us as a brewer. So for me, if anybody's seen 12 Years a Slave, Solomon Northup writing his story about how he was captured. He was an amazing violinist. His wife was an amazing chef. And, they had a life in upstate New York. And then because of slavery, he happened to be working one day, as you probably know the story, and someone took him down to Georgia, some part of the South, and he was unable to leave, enslaved for 12 years. I just walked around that area going to the marker, my mom and I thinking, wow, what was that like? Right here on that spot is where he was captured. I'm brewing down the block. You're constantly reminded of the stories and the history, and you take something away from that. A lot of it is very inspirational. Not always the best, greatest, most positive stories, but just realizing what it took for him to survive those 12 years. And when you ask me the question about how difficult it's been difficult. I could tell you some stories, but it wasn't like Solomon Northup. I can't even imagine that life. So brewing there, as a brewer, it took on a whole meaning for me to be in that city. So yeah, we'll get back to those stories when we have a beer.
Sounds like a plan.
So I mentioned to you that, why did I end up in Harlem? What was it about Harlem? Where as kids, we walked down 125th Street, up and down 125th Street. Harlem Week for us was every day. Whenever we got an opportunity to go to Harlem, see our cousins, be part of the culture. Going into the Apollo, walking on the stage, going to the Studio Museum, walking to Hotel Teresa. All this stuff was very nostalgic. It was very important for us to just be there. Even though a lot of the history of that particular time had passed, somehow we felt like, we were reliving it with my mom and my dad being in this place. So I kind of thought about that. Growing up, it was Apollo night, the night at the Apollo. All that stuff was such an important part of, like food, nurturing. So I was really excited about being able to go to Harlem and be a part of what some people call the Second Renaissance. And I took my mom's pot, because she's always packing. Every time I go home, she's like, take this stuff. Like, Mom, I got a small apartment, can't take all this stuff.
Right.
But she sent me with this pot, and when I started homebrewing there, reading the instructions about how to make beer, having an idea, because I like putting beer in everything. When I tell you I like putting beer in everything, my friends are like, come on, Celeste, can you just leave the beer out? But in fact, I found, no discovery, lots of people know this, that beer adds lots of flavor to many things. And for some of the meats and other stuff, it tenderizes it, so you don't have to use that other stuff. And I love the taste of, putting beer in my chicken, baking it, canning the turkey, canning the chicken, all that stuff was just, I just love the flavor. Not everybody always loved it, but this is something that I really enjoyed. And looking at soul food is great, don't get me wrong, absolutely the way it is. But any food that you love cooking, if you have a mind for experimentation, it's kind of fun to do it. And in Harlem, when I started homebrewing, taking my mom's 10-gallon pot, there were 6 of us in my family. Soup was a big thing. Whether it was fresh soup with water, lentils, pintos, rice, leftover squash, you had the leftover soup, you pull everything out of the refrigerator. My mom can make soup out of anything. So she parted with this one pot. So when I finally got the homebrewers kit as a gift, it's like, oh, wow, I need a pot. It was well seasoned, a lot of little nicks and things in there. I was like, can I use this? Because with brewing, everything has to be sanitized. Anyway, I cleaned it up very well. And that was where my first brew happened, in that pot, bringing it from the South to Harlem. And that was kind of special. It was like, wow, not only am I going to brew beer, I'm going to do this in this pot. This thing has been around for a little while. And that's how it started. And literally, I lived 123rd across from Marcus Garvey Park, not too far from this picture that you see of the Apollo Theater. And again, the history, something about cooking and making stuff in a place that's just full of all this history, because you kind of take that, it infuses your mind, and somehow maybe it does in a way affect what you cook, influences that. So this is where it started. Us going around as a home brewer, sharing my home brews with friends, having people over, a bar that I know, and most importantly, you heard me say earlier, Sylvia's restaurant. Sylvia Wood got one of the first bottles of our first Harlem Brew, which was Sugar Hill,
Oh.
named for the storied history that Billy Strayhorn wrote the song "Take the A Train" up to Sugar Hill in Harlem, which was this amazing neighborhood. Writers, politicians, medical, art, chefs, all of that was there. So it was the song "Take the A Train" up to Sugar Hill in Harlem was all about exploring all of the craft and creativity and promise of our people, of our country. And in thinking about, okay, yeah, I can make beer. Before I got into the beer business, I worked with Ben and Jerry's Partner Shop. Got to meet Ben, got to meet Jerry. I love chocolate ice cream, so that was part of the reason why I got involved, honestly. But I did ask him one day, well, what do you think about, you guys do all the good stuff with beer. With ice cream. How can I do something that makes a difference with beer? He's like, good luck, Ben. Good luck, Celeste. So anyway, he said, let me know what happens. And what I learned, because a lot of the work that I was involved at that time was community work, working with Ben and Jerry's, which was run by a homeless shelter. It was just really a time where at the corner of 125th and 5th Avenue, everything was happening. If you've heard of Shea Moisture, the hair product, some of you, that was Rich Dennis, the guy that sold Shea butter right at the corner of 125th and 5th. He had a place, part of the National Black Theater. Then the Body Shop came. Then the Ben and Jerry's franchise came in there, which was owned by African American entrepreneur by the name of Joe Holland. All of that energy was going on. So, okay, get to the point. What does it have to do with this beer? Well, some friends said, your beer isn't that bad. Go make some more. I finally figured that out. And then decided to take the leap, pivot, as I heard someone say earlier, into not just brewing beer, but actually building a company around it. This was the first beer that we launched, really paying homage to that history. Because part of the lesson that I learned in this country that we live in this world that we live in, is that I think it's incredibly important for us to do the things that we love, and as entrepreneurs to make a difference where we can. So we learned a lot about how products like beers can support schools, can support organizations, can help them raise funds. And that's been a big part of what we've experienced with the brand. This is our 125th Street IPA, an homage to 200 years of 125th Street. That cultural corridor has been a part of Harlem, carried every personality, people in the community, protests, launches, everything you can imagine, been very much part of the 125th Street corridor. The Apollo is there, the Studio Museum is there, the Teresa Hotel is there, the Harlem Week activities. There's so much stuff that happens on that corridor. So in looking at how beer can obviously serve as a complement to food and help us add flavor and enjoy beer like our ancient ancestors did. They had whole festivities throughout the African continent, all around ceremony, all around experiences. So looking at this again as a platform for talking about culture and history, that was our 125th Street IPA. So what about that beer and migration thing? So I think the conversation about beer and migration is really about how people connect. In this picture, in my Brudio, as I call it, on 141st and Convent, right down the block from not only City College, but half a block from Alexander Hamilton's house. Alexander Hamilton, you hear the play Hamilton. Alexander Hamilton lived many years ago, of course, right down the block from where I had my Brudio, which was part of an Airbnb beer experience, bringing people from around the block and around the world into a setting with that pot on a convection plate, small batch stuff, to have an experience, but to have a conversation, talking about all the places that they were from, talking about their beer experiences and the places that they came from. Just a wonderful time for us to just connect, find ways to find common ground and all that stuff. So that was something I've particularly enjoyed, connecting, how we connect cultures, how we connect people, how we connect purpose to what it is we do. Richmond, Virginia, we had a class in a grocery store. They had a little community room there. They invited me to come down and have a conversation again about beer, its history, connecting people, getting people into the brewing experience, looking at the history, but also connecting to local culture, and mainly more than anything, having a conversation. I mentioned earlier our Harlem Renaissance beer. This is a beer that I absolutely love brewing. I love putting spices in my beers, opening up the kitchen cabinet on a basic pale ale recipe, and especially my mom's house, pulling out the nutmeg, pulling out the cinnamon, pulling out everything I can find that I haven't thrown in there yet. Boiling the beer, letting it go through all of its boiling and cooking and extraction of all the flavors from the grains, and adding all that stuff at the end, and sometimes again right before we can it or bottle it. So this beer has some of my favorite spices: coriander, cumin, grains of paradise, orange peel, more orange. It's a highly citrusy wheat beer, but happens to be, as I mentioned to you, it has all the dates at the top of each decade of the Harlem Renaissance. And in launching this beer and talking about this particular beer, it was really about connecting to all those amazing organizations in Harlem and outside of Harlem that were part of the Great Migration. Because that Great Migration from where we are here in North Carolina, so much of what became the epicenter of African American culture in Harlem came from the South and the Caribbean to a large extent. Many of the poets, many of the thinkers, many of the makers were from the South and from the Caribbean and Africa as well, the continent, and a number of other countries. This is really this is the statement we were making about this beer by connecting it to the Renaissance, using it as we can do these days with beers, especially craft beers. We get more crafty, we're more focused on purpose and celebrating these different things. That's what this beer was about. Unfortunately, because of COVID in 2020, we weren't able to do all the stuff we wanted to do to celebrate the Renaissance, but we're hoping to do that. Bringing us here, talked about migration. The migration, I think, happened from the late 1800s. We had the 20s, 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, and it continued because as Harlem and other cities like it continued to evolve and go through its various renaissance. More entrepreneurs came, they heard the story about what Chef is doing, what I was doing, and they were like, man, I want to be a part of it. You hear about Atlanta, it's a magnet for drawing creative people and people that are entrepreneurial and community minded. Same thing in Harlem. So what you see happening now is I think it's called reverse migration, right? Where, not totally, but where you have now in the world that we've seen all the movements, Black Lives Matter, so many other things that have happened to enlighten and educate people about what's going on. Now what you have happening that's really exciting isn't the total remigration back south, but a kind of cooperative relationship where you have entrepreneurs, retired teachers, all types of people going back south and saying, what can we do to help bring the communities that have been forgotten or communities that need resources? What can we do? We've been in Harlem, we survived. What's the song? Jay-Z and what's the name? New York, New York. If you can make it there, you can make it anywhere. We survived. And they really have great expectations because they're like, wow, you survived that. Come back to the South. Help us. That's what's happening in Rocky Mount. You have multiple people that left home in Rocky Mount or left areas of the South now coming back, looking to build. So, and what's the beer part? So we happen to be the beer part, but they're, videographers, medical people, legal people, artists. It's amazing. I walk down the block in Rocky Mount or be on Convent Avenue when I'm in Harlem. And if they hear me say Rocky Mount on my phone, I literally have been stopped. Did you say Rocky Mount? I'm like, oh, wow. That's where I'm from. I mean, it's just been amazing to see, as it was during the Great Migration, how much of a connection still every place in the South has a connection, as we know, to Harlem and places like it. And now many of them, I can be on the street in Rocky Mount, mention New York, oh man, I just moved from there. Or I'm from there or whatever. So it's been really a beautiful thing to see this reverse thing, this people coming back home and saying, you know what, when I left there, I didn't think there was a lot for me, but I really think I have something to offer. I'm going to go back home, or at least go back there part-time and be a part of it. And it's happening in downtown. Harlem Brew South is really an extension of the honor and privilege I had of being in Harlem and being a part of the energy there.
Celeste, aside from Harlem Brew South and Rocky Mount, are there other places that people can try or purchase your beer? Because people are in the comments really wanting to try it.
Come here today. No, we are revamping because through COVID we had some challenges. So we are actually sold here in North Carolina. We have a beer that I didn't even talk about called 1946. That should be in the market within 2 weeks. I don't think we have more slides. I know we're running out of time. But so this is another picture. I'm going to pause here for a moment. You asked do we have more beer? Yes, to answer your question, we have our 1946 beer, which is a tribute to this marker you see here. The tobacco warehouse that you saw is a historic tobacco warehouse. What happened there is that more than 10,000, mostly African American women, during the tobacco industry, cast a vote in that location where we are. And as a result of that vote, which was a precursor to the civil rights movement, they were trying to get better pay, better working conditions. It happened here. We collaborated on a beer with a brewery in Pennsylvania called Evergreen on the beer called 1946. It's a orange Pilsner beer. So that will be available. Don't know all the locations. You can go to our website and see the locations, but it will be available here. The challenge we've had, not to get into the challenge, is that the tobacco warehouse that we're very happy to have, it's been a huge challenge for us to get plumbing in there. I don't even want to go into politics about what that's all about. So we've had to kind of do all this creative stuff to get beer out. And one of those ways that brewers can get beers out is to collaborate with other brewers. So look for our 1946 beer, which is orange Pilsner beer that we'll have available within 2 weeks. Speaking of that, these are some of the beers. The 1946 is the one on the left. It has images of African American tobacco farmers, people in the tobacco industry. I've gotten some feedback on the label. Well, why do you want to put them on the label? Why not? You got to get this stuff in front. We can't keep hiding behind it. You need to be able to get things out in front of people, whether it's on the beer label, whether it's through amazing museums like this place, whatever those platforms and places are, we have to talk about these things. It has to be part of our conversation. The beer in the middle was a small batch beer that I homebrewed in advance of us partnering with the Buck Leonard Foundation. Buck Leonard was one of the greatest baseball players in the world, Negro League. his family and the foundation wanted to do a beer. So this is going to be out probably by June, and then the Queen Stout beer. We have several other beers that we brew. We've done a number of collaborations. This is a picture when we talk about, what can breweries do to make a difference in the community. This is a performance that took place a few months ago in the tobacco warehouse, where we're working on getting our brewery and everything established once we get water. This is the Harlem Blues and Jazz Band, which came to perform on Thelonious Monk's birthday. Thelonious Monk was born in Rocky Mount, so there's an incredible history in connecting again Harlem, cities like Harlem, and amazing communities like Rocky Mount. They came to perform, and Earl Imes, who's the curator here at the museum, was very instrumental in helping make that happen. And then let's just hop it up.
The hops.
I am huge. Being in North Carolina, I was a member of the Future Farmers of America. So I learned a lot about farming, spent time on our grandparents' tobacco farm in Wilmington. They grew everything. Whatever they needed to survive, they grew it. I fell in love with growing hops because I love annuals. They're cute. It's a lot of work. Not that much work, but I love to see stuff come back. Nothing more beautiful than seeing those perennials come back. You put a lot of work into it. It's just a beautiful thing. And hops, if you want to grow hops, definitely DM me or let me know. You've got to have a spot that's really warm, at least 6 hours a day between April and August. But I love sharing my rhizomes. If anybody's interested in growing them, we have them growing in Harlem. We have them on 118th Street. We have them on 141st Street. We just spread in the Harlem hops everywhere. So if you're interested in learning about growing hops, it happens to be a passion of mine. Currently growing them right outside of Rocky Mount in a place called Canita, with the Canita Farms. That's a little bit about my story. Beer migration. I don't know if Chef has any more closing questions or anyone else have any.
What advice would you give someone that's trying to get into brewery?
Call me.
Call me now.
Well, yeah. So I am very passionate about getting people into the brewing industry, particularly people who you don't see in the industry. Black and brown people, women, whoever, but that's a big focus of mine. And Rocky Mount, we are creating something called the Brewers Village, which is really a space to allow people that want to learn to brew or have a serious interest in getting involved with the brewing industry. Definitely, if you have that passion, reach out to me. We're trying to build a place that we can share, a place of inspiration to get more brewers, as well as Black farmers growing the grains, which is something we're doing. So if you want to grow grains, you want to brew beer, definitely reach out to us.
And how do they reach out?
You can reach out to us through our website, harlembrewing.com, harlembrewsouth.com. If you want to reach me directly, email me at harlembrew@gmail.com.
Social media?
Social media, Harlem Brew on Instagram. That'd probably be the best place. Twitter, you can reach us Twitter, but so many different platforms, I can't keep up with them. But definitely Instagram, Harlem Brew on Facebook.
Beautiful. It has definitely been a pleasure. The first Black African American brewer. I am honored to meet you, and I'm sure everyone else is honored. So it has been a pleasure to have you here. Is there any more questions?
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me here, and I can't wait to taste those crab cakes.
I can't wait to taste this
Beer and
here.
crab cakes? Are you kidding me? Bring it on.
Match made in heaven.
Thank you so much. Appreciate it.
Thank you for joining us at the 21st Annual African American Cultural Celebration. Please check out our website, nc-aacc.com, to view videos on demand. Thank you.